Hello, History 102 and 17B class. My name is Derek Cowell, History Adjunct, and I wanted to jump right into Reconstruction. All right. Before doing so, please note that you have an argumentative assignment due Sunday evening online. Please just read the first two sections only regarding historical context to Reconstruction via coverage of the Civil War. And then also, please do number 3, the third section on Reconstruction, which, as you'll see, is very argumentative. Please show me that you've discerned the thesis, you've picked apart its strengths and weaknesses, and what you conclude as far as its credibility. And of course, I don't care what direction you go on that. Just make sure that you support your claims, and I'm great with it. All right? So please don't forget about that. But regarding the Civil War, what you'll find in these takes, right, the first two sections on the Civil War, is historians, they select facts, they interpret facts and organize them, and they present them. And they do it in different ways, right? Different worldview, different assumptions that they bring to the table are going to affect, how they choose those facts, how they organize them, how they present them. So for instance, as an intro to the class, right? Oftentimes in history, there have been great man pieces. It's called great man history, right? It does not mean that the person is a great person by any means morally. What it does mean is that they assume that events happen the manner by which they do, largely on account of the decisions, the personalities, etc., of the leading men in charge in historical offices, right? So hence, you want to know about the Civil War, where you read about Abraham Lincoln and the major senators, etc., right, in the antebellum before the Civil War era, leading up to it. So we'll, of course, do some great man history throughout the class. As a bit of an antithesis to that, right, is some have called it history from below, and others contend no. We not only want to focus upon the common people, certain demographics, right, farmers, industrial laborers, people who seem to have been omitted from the great man history textbooks, right? We want to look at them, not only because they might have some type of an objective as far as the thesis that the writer is trying to come up with, but also because they believe that they are heavily involved in causation, that the common people, especially when you have a republican form of government like the U.S., which is systematically supposed to be largely tied to majority sentiment. Okay, so at any rate, getting into this from history from below, you look at just the culture in the South, culture in the North, and of course you can't forget economics, right? Of course, Karl Marx and other Marxist historians and so forth, they believe that self-interest, especially the two together, right? Economic enrichment and the domination of power politically tend to be tied in to the same, quote, winners in history. And as you might guess, Marxist history, kind of like Howard Zinn's The People's History of the U.S., it vilifies those people. It vilifies the winners as being horrific parasites who unjustly enrich themselves at the expense of the many. Right? So along with that, you're going to have people who will focus on in the Civil War the leading industrialist and other lobbyist groups who some people believe had the politicians of the North in their pockets versus the planters, right? The slave-owning masters, the wealthy ones in the South. So there's a touch of all of that to Numbers 1 and 2 if you look at my argumentative write-up, okay? But again, please just write on number 3 and just read Numbers 1 and 2. Excuse me. So at any rate, with the Civil War, court history, C-O-U-R-T, court history is basically the account written by the winners, those who politically win and gain power and get to dictate the type of political system that's put into effect, those who economically gain the lion's share of resources and or decide what type of economic system will prevail in their society, and socially, those who get to dictate culture and get to socialize the kids, teaching them right from wrong, taboo from normal, etc., etc., right? So court history is technically, it's kind of a romantic rose-colored glass that you're looking through, right? In which you praise Abraham Lincoln, you praise all the presidents for that matter, the Pilgrims and Puritans in your 101 class and so forth, right? And because it's also tied to a term called American exceptionalism, that this country is exceptional, it's better, it's unique in a superior way to many other countries, right? And of course, you could probably easily guess what is highly integral to that thesis, that take that we have an exceptional country, right? And the two are intertwined. As far as the boasts that you'll always read in court history books. One, right, the connection of this country to freedom, right, to freedom and also to opportunity, right, that this is the land of the American dream, and it is, well, we'll get into more details on that, but I think you get the point, right? So that we're in a special, liberty-loving country that is just laden with economic opportunities for virtually everyone, et cetera, right? And then those who want to revise the court history, who see it from a different perspective than from the manner by which the initial historians, recorders, have written a narrative of their own, we generically call that revisionist history. They want to revise, change, challenge the prevailing thesis. So revisionist history on the Civil War. Let me go backwards. I apologize. Court history of the Civil War, right? We fought to continue and to put into more complete fulfillment the rhetoric that we praised during the War for Independence. That we're finally going to put into practice the axiom that all men are created equal, and that this is a land of, by, or government of, by, and for the people, etc., right? So court history depicts the Civil War as a crusade. It says the North, the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, of course the abolitionists, and the, quote, radical Republicans in the Republican Party, that they were ahead of their day. They were progressive. They were idealistic in wanting to improve the world. They were courageous and no longer just ignoring the elephant in the room regarding American politics, right? Where you just didn't mention slavery. It was that unspoken rule. It was there. Everyone was cognizant of it, but you just didn't bring it up to Southern reps. And so now in court history, you have this brave, just progressive, idealistic, wanted to change the world generation of antebellum reformers, right, in the 1830s through 50s. And then you also are going to have polarizing events like the Fugitive Slave Law, John Brown's raid, the caning of Charles Sumner, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, events that almost made you pick a side. They were so dramatic. Etc. So at any rate, along with this court history is praise of Abraham Lincoln, great man history of Abraham Lincoln, contending that he came around, that he, by his own admission, he was not a strong abolitionist by any stretch of the imagination or by reputation, really even up through the war, according to the abolitionists themselves, but that he slowly came around just in time by the end of his death, by the end of the Civil War, whereby he was increasingly seeing this war not as a war over states' rights and secession, not as a power struggle between the planter class and the industrial bourgeoisie, that's just generically people from the city that were the dominant faction in the North. A faction is a group that shares the same interests and or beliefs, right? And so at any rate, that he became somewhat of a crusader by the end of his death, by the end of his life, right? Whereby he's almost martyred, according to quotes of John Wilkes Booth regarding Lincoln's last speech regarding Louisiana and citizenship for some African Americans. So at any rate, that's court history. Revisionist history states this had nothing to do with slavery directly, morally, ethically. This was a power struggle, this Civil War. The North and South wanted, what was it technically fought over? What caused the secession, the leaving of 11 states, the exit of 11 states of the South from the Union when Lincoln was elected? It's his refusal to allow slavery to extend anywhere else in the far West, where future states would blossom. So at any rate, right, regarding this, you got to remember that the faction thesis, if you are a cotton farmer in Alabama or Georgia, what's good for you is going to be the same, just as advantageous for a cotton farmer in New Mexico, right? So that person is going to likely vote along with you as an ally because he shares the same self-interest that you do, right? And so the idea is that each faction, the people of the city, the bourgeoisie up in the north versus the planters in the south, that they wanted to gain allies, factional allies in the West. And they knew they could do that by either securing slavery or not securing slavery, because it was kind of taken, again, as an axiom that slaves were needed for labor like tobacco and cotton and rice and sugar and indigo cultivation, but that they were not needed in places where they grew wheat and other farm produce, not to mention industrializing, right? The industrialization that began happening in the early to mid 1800s. It was just taken as an axiom that African American slaves were not necessary to work in those conditions in that type of economic environment. So at any rate, some people believe that they fought over that it was over power, that you get 2 senators in every new western state, 1 rep for every 30,000 civilians, and those are allies that you could build in Congress, right? And then, of course, you read Johnny Reb and other books, and they'll contend that many people in the South were not fighting for rich man slaves, but they were fighting simply on libertarian grounds. Remember, libertarian is that you have a healthy fear and mistrust of government, and you believe that it inherently becomes more dangerous the more centralized and the more large it becomes. So hence the libertarian tradition, going back before Thomas Jefferson in America, oftentimes assumed, right or wrong, erroneous or true, that the infringement of people's liberties would be less dangerous, less likely if government were localized. And so hence to some Southerners, they simply wanted the state of Alabama, the county that they resided in Alabama, for instance, to decide on slavery. And then it was Washington, D.C.'s, it was none of Washington, D.C.'s business, right? And then likewise, you have people in the North who wanted jobs available only for white men and did not want to compete with, quote, Negroes for jobs, etc., right? Who believed that slavery was inefficient and archaic, like from a bygone age, because people were, they have no incentive, right? They have no incentive to work hard besides just avoiding the lash. And so at any rate, you have a myriad of reasons why Northerners could have opposed slavery, not on humanitarian or progressive bases, okay? And then also some Northerners, as evident in the liberty laws in the North against the Fugitive Slave Act, it was a lot of them felt like the planter class was throwing its weight around too often and too heavily, and that faction in particular needed to become put in its place. and that Southerners in general had no right to secede. To some, it was just a matter of mere patriotism, that how could you go against your own country and try to leave it? So at any rate, people fought for a myriad of reasons, evidently. But those are the broad perspectives that usually are employed when you read a history book on the Civil War. All right. An historian that I rely heavily upon on this subject is Eric Foner. He's won awards and he's written many good books on the topic of slavery and Reconstruction. And of course, you have the famous Shelby Foote, if you're into the military one, or James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. So at any rate here, getting into this. So the war ends, and as you know, right, the northern states win. They defeat the Confederacy, and largely it was a matter of resources. It was a matter of resources and fighting the Confederacy on enough fronts simultaneously, spreading them too thinly so that they couldn't contend, so that the North would inevitably win a war of attrition, that they would outlast the South. And that's virtually what they did. But what also helped was the gentleman second from the right, Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman. Those two in particular, is critics will contend that they were a little bit anomalously out of the ordinary, vicious in their fighting tactics and so forth. Well, not so much Grant with vicious, because he didn't have allegations from civilians in the South, etc., but mainly that he was callous and throwing his men to their deaths in battle in his pursuit of crushing the Southern Confederate Army. So at any rate, when you want to look at those accusations, I would suggest looking at Shiloh in particular, Vicksburg, and the Wilderness Campaign. So at any rate, the North is going to end up winning. I don't want to get too long into this because it's just, I'm trying to keep it tied to Reconstruction, okay? But when the war is over, right, you have African Americans suddenly are freed by way of the 13th Amendment, because remember, the Emancipation Proclamation declared only the slaves of rebels to be freed, but the 13th Amendment declared all slaves free. So with the passage of the 13th Amendment, but even prior to that, African Americans left their plantations in droves, looking for loved ones, catching up to the Union Army, etc. And so the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established in 1863 by Congress, as well as the U.S. Army after especially the first two confiscation acts, they are going to begin to help provide for African Americans who are fleeing bondage. So one way in which this was done, right, were contraband camps, such as those established by Ulysses Grant, whereby they established schools for the young African American kids. They provided jobs and employment for the African American freedmen. They put them to work, however, also for the Union Army, but they were to be recompensed for it. They weren't paid the same when they fought as soldiers. They were not accepted as soldiers initially. There was a big draft riot in New York City with some people chanting, "We won't die," for the N-words. So don't get me wrong, the North did not come in. The primary sources just don't seem to illustrate that the North was not just this progressive army coming in to liberate and be a source of uplifting for African Americans necessarily. Matter of fact, there was a gentleman named William Dunning who wrote a thesis contending that the North did what it did for African Americans of the South largely as a punitive measure, a punishing measure toward the white South, to spite or weaken the white South. So at any rate, right, you have quotes. You have quotes from Grant, from Lincoln. You even have a sad quote from George Julian when he's addressing other senators and said, basically, "I tried to appeal to your humanitarianism. That didn't seem to work. So now I'm going to appeal to your pragmatism, is basically using, quote, Negro soldiers will psychologically damage the white South. It'll frighten them. It'll shake them in their boots. They will fear retribution, right? And they'll fear, of course, a large slave rebellion, feeling emboldened by the news or even sight of African American soldiers fighting against them. So at any rate, for various reasons, not always altruistic ones, the North is going to help out African Americans at the end of the war. They're even going to confiscate land from Confederates, some Confederates in certain areas like the Sea Islands, off of, I believe it's South Carolina, like Edisto Island, Edisto. They're going to give what later will be known as, promised by the Freedmen's Bureau, 40 acres and a mule to every freedman family that's been has been enslaved and was liberated by way of the 13th Amendment. And of course, that's not going to stick. And that's one of the reasons why some people believe that the North was lukewarm in its support for African Americans. Technically, it will be the Supreme Court that nullifies this, because they didn't use eminent domain. They didn't claim tax evasion, certain loopholes that they may have been able to use. And so hence they said, you know, by way of the Fourth Amendment alone, people are entitled to their property, right? Until, and not to mention also the 14th Amendment. They're entitled to their property unless by due process they're duly convicted. And so at any rate, on that technicality, the land will go back to the white ex-Confederates. All right. So then you have, at the war's end, you have a problem with a Southern white backlash, racist backlash, right? So the gentleman you see in the middle is Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was nearly captured and fought against at Fort Donelson by Grant's men in their attack, but he got out just in time. He is going to help establish the Ku Klux Klan, right? And so with the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations akin to it, they're going to try to offset the advantages and the empowerment that African Americans were suddenly starting to receive and to embrace and to perceive themselves, right? In order to desire keeping them in their place, right? And so, of course, you have to a certain extent mass scale neurosis here, whereby a lot of people believe that just the guilty conscience of the South collectively, especially of the antebellum leaders, knowing what they had condoned, the mistreatment of slaves, because there's just too much evidence to support it, to even try to refute it, of how awfully slaves were treated. And so at any rate, there was great fear, right? And not to mention the Sambo image, S-A-M-B-O, that was largely cultivated through music and other artistic genres and throughout Southern culture, claiming that the black man, right, was very bestial, like a big dumb animal, that he lacked self-control, that he was a product of his just biological urges, his id, so to speak, or right, or what the Greeks would call his appetite. And so hence he couldn't handle freedom if you gave it to him, that he would run wild, chasing after women, using violent means to get what he wants unjustly from others, etc., right? And so you combine that type of collective guilty conscience with a Sambo image, and I don't pretend that those are the only two factors that are relevant to this topic, but those are the two primary ones that I come across in my books, and those are the only two that are presently in my nervous brain right now. So at any rate, with this great fear, there was a desire of the white South to keep the N-words in their place, right? The uppity N-words was a common expression at that time, sadly. So at any rate, especially Texas, you have some very scary facts in Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction regarding Texas and how many murders there were just in a few years span, and how every single white suspect of having killed a black man was exonerated, was declared innocent without a single exception. So at any rate, you have that problem and that issue going on, right? So then, as you know, Lincoln is going to be killed by John Wilkes Booth, and the man in the middle, Andrew Johnson, will become president. And remember, Lincoln was trying to arguably balance his ticket. He saw that people like John C. Fremont, Salmon Chase, and others who ran for president, William Seward and others who ran for office, and on a radical Republican platform, largely lost even in their own northern districts, how much less the southern states. So there was also a tactical thing here, supposedly, by Lincoln's admission, that he wanted to kind of balance his ticket in 1864 and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to run with a Southerner who remained loyal to the Union, right? And remember William Dunning and Dunning's thesis, right, that the North did what it did for African Americans to spite the white South. Well, that seemed to have been the expectation of radical Republicans and others regarding their view of Andrew Johnson running as his vice presidential running mate. Andrew Johnson never pretended to be anything close to an abolitionist or anything like that, although he does have a famous quote where he very condescendingly tells a black crowd that he is going to be their Moses, right? But at any rate, besides that and a few anomalous quotes, there just wasn't a whole lot to hope for with him regarding, today's standards. And some would say that's unfair to judge him by today's standards. But at any rate, but that at least even if for the wrong reasons, right, wanting to punish the white South, he would help out African Americans. And many people became disappointed very quickly. So at any rate, Andrew Johnson, he punished white Confederates when he became the governor of Union-occupied Tennessee during the Civil War. Tennessee, Maryland, Missouri, Louisiana, those were Southern Confederate states that the Union, in the midst of the war, earlier than others, defeated and conquered and imposed a new government upon, right? So he in Tennessee, they issued ironclad oaths so that if you had done anything to support the Confederacy, you were to be disenfranchised, stripped of your citizenship rights for whatever period of time. And so at any rate, very much evidence of him, of kind of the Dunning thesis, but no branching out, no olive branch, no hand metaphorically reached out to African Americans as far as citizenship for any of them. Okay, and so he becomes president, and he decides to kind of lead the Reconstruction process without the aid and assistance of Congress. And so when he comes in, he makes it very lenient. He has a 1/10 clause, so that all you had to do was have 1/10 of the population formally apologize for the Civil War in your southern state and pledge future allegiance to the Constitution and to the federal government. And then you could go back to the 1860, prior to the Civil War, electorate, those who could vote and who couldn't. And of course, in 1860 in the South, could any African Americans vote and run for office and have full-fledged citizenship rights? Of course not, right? So at any rate, they go back to an 1860 electorate and citizenry. They make it very easy for the South to be forgiven and brought back into the fold, the national fold. And even with the exception where it looked like he was going to be harsh toward the planters, because there was a socioeconomic chip that he had on his shoulder about having been called white trash growing up. He made the planter class, who made more than, I think it was $20,000 or something, which of course was much more back then. He made them personally come and seek forgiveness from him. But the thing is he gave it to whoever virtually did come and ask, suggesting that it may have been ego-driven. and his ego was satiated, arguably, when they came to beg for their citizenship. So at any rate, under Andrew Johnson, he chooses mainly Whig governors. So not Democrats who are just overt fire eaters and for the Civil War. He didn't go that far, remember, because the way he was as governor of Tennessee, he was really big on loyalty to the country, and hence not happy about the disloyalty of the Confederacy. Nevertheless, none of the hand-picked governors, without exception, none of them was even close to an abolitionist, right? Someone who wanted to abolish slavery, take it on before and during the Civil War, not care how it was implicitly and almost explicitly condoned in the Constitution, etc., want it out of the system anyway, right? Regardless. So nothing like that amongst any of the governors. And in fact, they issued black codes, and the black codes were awful. African Americans had to sign labor contracts if they were found loitering on someone's property, because remember, many of them were roaming looking for loved ones. They had they were homeless when they were freed. And so at any rate, they could be fined and have to work that fine off for a planter, oftentimes given their ex-master the first opportunity to buy their fine and make them work it off. They had apprenticeship laws, whereby they would take the young African-American boys and girls and make them work for their old masters or for others, right, other white employers, contending that it was for their own good and that their family could not sustain them financially. You had laws that were symbolic. They couldn't ride horses, African Americans that is, wear silk. Of course, culturally, they're supposed to doff their hat and give the sidewalk, give the walkway to white folk, especially white women. There were just lots of different degrading, discriminatory laws in these black codes against African Americans, but mainly, according to Eric Foner, so much of it was the two, right? The twin two is one, there was a need to keep them in the fields, somebody in the fields for that matter, right? To keep the cotton coming and selling. And so there was great need for their agricultural labor. And so they tried to pigeonhole them there via these black codes. And then also the desire to culturally remind African Americans of their place and not let them get too cocky to the point of becoming dangerously emboldened, right, and defiant toward the white folk. So at any rate, you have those things going on, right? And then also when the Congress did reconvene, they passed laws that they felt were pretty moderate, right? Like the 1866 Civil Rights Act, right? That was just to protect the wages of African American laborers and their access to property. And President Johnson, vetoed it. The Freedmen's Bureau, right, which was established in 1863 to help adjudicate disputes between black and white down in the South during the war and to help the plight of African Americans down during the war. It was never meant to be permanent, but it was meant to be longer than a couple years. And Andrew Johnson vetoed its extension, saying that it was inherently a racist organization because it only helped African Americans. So that's what Congress was running into. So then Congress, right, they're going to, so you see other here examples. Anti-miscegenation laws, so laws against black and white Southerners getting married or having children. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And then you had, the idea is that it went too far, right? That the South was appearing to be, quote, unrepentant, not the least bit remorseful, contrite about the war, about its stubbornness regarding racial relations with African Americans. And and here they were after the war, just unapologetically going right back to the way things were before, right? There's an interesting book called Slavery in All But Name, the way African Americans were put back into the fields, even though technically slavery had ended, had been prohibited. So at any rate, right, by the end of the war, or by the end of presidential Reconstruction, there was consensus in the North that what do we even fight this war for? The South needs to be put in its place. And there were other events that I'm not going to take the time to get into that are on this slide, etc. But just suffice it to say that's the thesis, according to Eric Foner and many other major historians on this topic, is that the North tired of this. So especially by way of the 1866 congressional elections, the North is going to elect a majority, pretty much a super majority of radical Republicans into Congress. Now they could override the president's vetoes and insist on running Reconstruction. So in the popular narrative, right, they start off taking roll, this new Congress, and they do not call out the names of the Southern reps. And the Southern reps, of course, respond afterward, immediately thereafter. You forgot our names. What about us? I said, oh, no, we don't acknowledge you. You guys have to start from scratch. You have to start again to be readmitted into the Union. We declare you to be conquered territory again, rather than states. So at any rate, at the end of the at this time, they're going to put the South into 5 military districts with the right of the military governors to declare martial law. Remember, under martial law, your civil liberties are not guaranteed. Okay, and the second section, the second clause of the 14th Amendment stated that if you had given an oath to defend the Constitution at any time, and then you subsequently broke that oath and joining and helping the Confederacy, that you were to be disenfranchised for 2 years. And so hence, any army officer, any politician, right, had to give an oath to the federal Constitution and getting sworn into that position. So hence, that disenfranchised the cream of the crop, arguably, of the white South, of the antebellum before the Civil War white South, right? So now notice the radical Republicans in Congress are not playing around, right? And remember, regarding the Dunning's thesis, is with some people like Thaddeus Stevens, I would subjectively make the claim that the two could coincide. I believe that there is evidence that Thaddeus Stevens was a genuine abolitionist, was a genuinely idealistic, progressive man ahead of his time, genuinely gave forth much of himself for the crusade to help the plight of African Americans, but also made no bones about it that he wanted the white South to be punished, right? And so the two could coexist. And you could probably say the same thing for almost any two theses of historical interpretation. So at any rate, right, then you move to so you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments now, the 14th and 15th now, under Radical Reconstruction. The 14th defines citizenship very broadly. Anyone born or naturalized, right? So now that is, and not to mention, in any state, it's going to nationalize the Bill of Rights. Now, anyone born or naturalized in any of the states is automatically a citizen of all of them, right? Sadly, that was not even the case before 1868 when it was ratified. And so at any rate, let's see here. The 15th Amendment, oh, and by the way, the 14th stated that all rights, liberties, protections, privileges thereof of citizenship shall not be abridged or taken away, right, to any citizen. So the 15th stated, oh, by the way, as far as those rights, privileges, powers of citizenship, suffrage, or the right to vote and run for office, is included in that, in case it wasn't clear. And suffrage shall not be stripped from anyone on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? And so at any rate, now African Americans can vote. And according to Eric Foner, they came out in proportions of 90%, 90% of eligible black voters went to the polls on election day. And that's despite the fact that 2 out of 10 were violently attacked. in doing such, right? They still came out. And so here, well, I'm not going to play it now, but I'll have this online. And if you've seen the movie, The Free State of Jones, it's a very tense voting scene. All right. So now at this point, right, you're going to get 2 black senators, 16 congressmen of African American heritage, over 600 state assemblymen, and thousands of local and state level positions are now going to be occupied by African Americans, right? So you see some of them here, Blanche K. Bruce, Hiram Revels, right? The point here, right, is a term that people will use as agency, is that African Americans were not just passive recipients and victims of historical circumstances, that they too made decisions that mattered. They too were historical agents who made decisions that helped steer the course of history. So regarding that theme with African Americans, like I mentioned before, they left their plantations. Some of those who stayed began demanding salaries, or else they would no longer work for the mistress or the master of the plantation. They formed fraternal and political organizations, oftentimes known as Liberty and Lincoln Leagues, right? Whereby any of them who might be literate would read the newspapers to them and apprise them of what's going on and what their rights were, etc., right? Oftentimes at first, it tended to be the African Americans who tended to take control and take over the situation were oftentimes freedmen themselves who were accustomed to having liberty, or preachers who were accustomed to have people listen to their sermons and who become literate and learning to read the Bible. Were also soldiers, ex-soldiers, right? So people who might arguably have developed a stronger sense of, I don't mean this in a negative way, but self-importance and confidence, so that they took it upon themselves to lead fellow African Americans. And what's interesting is when you look at the conciliatory tone when they first started, the African Americans serving as politicians in 1866, and you look by 1868 and you see how much more, like I said, I don't mean this negatively, but I can't think of another adjective at the moment, but a bit more militant or radical their platforms became. Some people say it's no coincidence that by 1868, a lot of the politicians had been slaves on plantations, so that there was a progressive change amongst African Americans themselves to look first toward those that they naturally had a little bit of deference toward as being other or different or better in their own estimation, to those who they wanted to belong to themselves, who came from their own, who knew what slavery was like, etc., right? So to me, that's fascinating in and of itself. But at any rate, with African Americans and others, right? Let's see if I put one on here. You have a couple quotes here. They have a genuine interest and a genuine earnestness in the business of assembly, which we are bound to recognize and respect. They have an earnest purpose, born of conviction that their conditions are not fully assured, which lends a sort of dignity to their proceedings. That's by James S. Pike. And then other quotes as well. But look at here, actually. Even by way of the white press, F. Barham Zinkel of Senator Beverly Nash, his ability. Let's see here. R.C. DeLarge wrote of Charles Wilder and Robert Eliot as the ablest in the legislature, these African Americans, right? Henry Shrewsbury as an opponent to corruption. Francis Cardoso as financially disciplined. Robert Smalls kept violent, striking black sharecroppers from violence, etc. So some of them did very well, these African American politicians, right? Then an uncomfortable part of the discourse is the claims of corruption and inept leadership. At this time, when you look across the country, there were so many opportunities of industrializing and development and giving business contracts by way of a government local, state, or federal, giving business contracts to corporations, etc., right? That because of the economic context at this time and the industrialization process, it opened it up for lots of temptations, right? To engage in graft, whereby basically, right, you get inside information about an area that's going to develop, and so you jump on it ahead of everybody else, and you use that inside information to enrich yourself, right? Case of nepotism, of giving jobs, opportunities, contracts to people that you know, people that are related to you, that are friends, etc., right? And not to mention areas of getting kickbacks, where you give a lucrative deal to a corporation and suddenly you own several stock shares in their stock. No coincidence, right? It's kind of a quid pro quo deal that you had made. So that happened throughout the country. And were African Americans immune to that temptation? No, they were not. They were human beings. And so the Southern white press is going to run with this and say, see, these N-words who have no self-control are showing it here. They're being corrupt. They're being negligent. They're being profligate. The idea of profligate, right? The school system, safety net legislation to help the unemployed, provide credit for those who want to aspire after the American dream. All that costs money, right? And it was difficult to tax their constituents. If we think it's difficult now, they were much more libertarian back then, where they wouldn't stand for much tax. So it was a lose-lose situation with all those things that they wanted to do as Southern politicians. They just weren't getting nearly enough income into the state to do them. So a lot of them became further indebted. Okay. So at any rate, the North is largely going to lose interest in the span of 12 years at the end of the Civil War. Particularly the drama going on over the Gilded Age that we're about to get into shortly. Drama going on over the West, right? All that's going on. And so Americans up in the North largely kind of lose their interest, right? Also, you have to remember the disenfranchisement of the ex-Confederates, that only lasted 2 years. So now they're re-enfranchised, right? And then the North having this odium in the South of the North keeping its soldiers long after the Civil War down into the South. That began to take a heavy toll in elections and so forth, right? Where Republicans did not want to continue this legacy of keeping soldiers down there. And so at any rate, then you have, of course, the outside politics, right? The KKK and other organizations really stepped up their violence and began really intimidating and deterring African Americans from being able to participate in politics. And so you put it all together, and it's going to culminate in the infamous Compromise of 1877, whereby Rutherford B. Hayes did not win. Neither he nor Samuel Tilden won a majority of electoral points. So it came down to those two at the top, and it went to the House. And Rutherford B. Hayes, there's good reason to infer that he promised the House that he would evacuate the South of its troops if they were to choose him instead of Democrat Tilden from New York. And so that's what happened. He was chosen by the House, Mr. Hayes, and he almost immediately withdrew the troops from the South. And when that happened, the African Americans no longer had a federal ally, and that was that. So at any rate, I hope this helped. If you have any questions, please use Canvas messaging or the second phone number that I gave you. Okay, and please just identify yourself by name, school, and class. And I wish you well. And nice to quasi-meet you. and I will be giving out an announcement soon. Thank you guys. Have a good day.